Lord, I whispered through tears, depression is killing me. Please, take it away from me. At that moment, I felt something supernatural enveloping me. The story you're about to hear is a true account. The names of characters and places have been changed to preserve the author's privacy. If you believe in miracles or have experienced one, leave your opinion in the comments and subscribe. I'll never forget the day I walked through the doors of the psychiatric unit. The smell of disinfectant hit me like a slap, reminding me that this was real. I, Carlos Martinez, the guy who always had a smile for everyone, was voluntarily admitting myself to a psychiatric hospital. How the hell had I gotten to this point? Full name and reason for admission, a nurse asked in a monotone voice, without even looking up from her computer. Carlos Martinez Gutierrez, I responded in a whisper. I'm here because I think I'm a danger to myself. Those words echoed in the small admission office, and for the first time, the nurse looked directly into my eyes. I saw a flash of compassion in her gaze, quickly replaced by professionalism. I understand, Mr. Martinez. Can you be more specific about your symptoms? I took a deep breath, feeling how the familiar pain in my chest intensified. It's like I have a monster inside me. Depression crushes me, yes, but the anxiety, my God, the anxiety is eating me alive. My voice broke on the last phrase, and I felt tears threatening to spill. The nurse offered me a tissue, her kind gesture contrasting with the cold efficiency of the place. How long have you been feeling this way? She asked while typing quickly on her computer. Weeks? No, months, I admitted. At first I thought I could handle it. Deep breathing, exercise, all those things they tell you help. But each day was worse. It got to a point where I couldn't even sit and watch television without feeling like I was suffocating. The nurse nodded, her expression neutral but her eyes revealing that she had heard similar stories hundreds of times. Are you currently taking any medication? Yes, antidepressants and anti-anxiety medications. But they don't seem to do much good. As I spoke, I felt a new wave of panic taking over me. The hallway behind the nurse seemed to stretch infinitely, full of closed doors and muffled voices. What was I getting myself into? I need to walk, I said abruptly, getting up from the chair. The nurse looked at me alarmed. Mr. Martinez, please, we need to finish the admission process. But I couldn't stay still anymore. The pain in my chest was unbearable, and I felt the walls closing in around me. Without saying another word, I left the office and began walking quickly down the hallway. Mr. Martinez. I heard the nurse call behind me, but I didn't stop. My footsteps echoed on the linoleum floor as I walked aimlessly, desperately trying to escape the storm in my mind. I passed by patients with lost looks and medical staff who watched me cautiously. At that moment, I realized I had crossed a threshold. I was no longer the Carlos from before, the confident and smiling man. Now I was just another patient, another lost soul in the corridors of the psychiatric unit. I stopped in front of a window, looking at the outside world that seemed so distant and unreachable. My reflection in the glass showed me a look I barely recognized. Sunken eyes, unkempt beard, the shadow of the man I used to be. My God, I whispered, pressing my forehead against the cold glass. What's happening to me? At that moment, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I turned startled to find myself face to face with a middle-aged man wearing a white doctor's coat. Mr. Martinez, he said in a calm but firm voice. I'm Dr. Ramirez. Why don't you come with me? I think we have a lot to talk about. I nodded weakly, too exhausted to resist. As I followed Dr. Ramirez back down the hallway, a part of me wondered if I would ever feel normal again. What I didn't know at that moment was that my journey through the abyss of the mind was just beginning, and that the miracle that would change my life was closer than I could have ever imagined. The days in the psychiatric unit blended into one another in a haze of medications and therapies. Each morning, I would wake up hoping it had all been a nightmare, only to find myself again in that sterile room, with the distant sound of footsteps in the hallway and the occasional muffled cry of another patient. One afternoon, after another exhausting group therapy session, I found myself alone in the hospital's small chapel. The place was deserted, illuminated only by the dim light of a few candles. I sat in the last pew, staring at the crucifix hanging on the front wall. "Why, God?" I whispered, feeling anger beginning to bubble up inside me. "Why have you abandoned me?" The silence that followed my question was deafening. I felt something break inside me, as if the last thread holding me together had snapped. "Answer me," I shouted, jumping to my feet. My voice echoed off the chapel walls, but the crucifix remained impassive, Jesus's painted eyes staring into the void. "I've been faithful all my life. I've followed your commandments. I've helped others. I've believed in you without questioning. And this is how you repay me?" I began pacing back and forth, unable to contain the storm of emotions consuming me. Do you know what it's like to feel like you're drowning with every breath? To be afraid of your own mind? Of course not. You're God. You're supposed to be all-powerful. In my rage, I grabbed one of the hymnals and threw it at the altar. The book hit the white cloth, knocking over a couple of candles that rolled across the floor. "You're a fraud. A children's tale. If you really existed, if you really cared, you wouldn't let your faithful suffer like this." "Mr. Martinez?" The soft but firm voice of the hospital chaplain startled me. I hadn't heard him enter. "Is everything all right?" I turned to face him, tears flowing freely down my cheeks. "No, Father. Nothing is all right. Nothing has been all right for a long time." The chaplain, an older man with graying hair and kind eyes, approached slowly. "Sometimes, in our darkest moments, is when we question our faith the most," he said, placing a hand on my shoulder. I shook off his hand, stepping back. "Don't come at me with those cliches, Father. I've heard all the platitudes, all the empty promises. God doesn't give you anything you can't handle? Nonsense. Look at me. I'm here, locked up, because I can't handle my own mind." The chaplain looked at me with a mixture of compassion and, "Was that understanding?" "Carlos," he said softly, using my first name for the first time. "Faith is an armor that protects us from pain. It's an anchor that keeps us afloat in the storm." "Well, my anchor has broken," I replied bitterly. "You know, I was once where you are now," said the chaplain, sitting down on one of the pews. His confession took me by surprise. "You? But you're a man of God." "Before being a man of God, I am a man," he responded with a sad smile. "Years ago, I lost my wife and daughter in a car accident. I was driving." His revelation left me speechless. I sat down beside him, listening in silence. For months, I cursed God. I shouted at him, insulted him, swore I would never believe in him again. I was so angry, so full of pain. I thought faith had abandoned me. And what happened? I asked, my own anger momentarily forgotten. I realized that faith isn't something that abandons us. We are the ones who sometimes need to let it go to find it again, he responded, his eyes shining with unshed tears. It wasn't easy, and it certainly wasn't quick. But little by little, I began to see the light again. His words resonated with me in a way I hadn't expected. For the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope. "Father," I said, my voice breaking, "I'm so scared. This anxiety, this depression, it's like they're eating me alive. I don't know who I am anymore." The chaplain took my hands in his. "Carlos, sometimes we need to lose ourselves to find ourselves. Your struggle isn't a punishment from God. It's part of your journey." We sat in silence for a moment. The only sound was the crackling of the candles that were still burning. "I can't promise you that everything will be all right tomorrow," the chaplain continued, "but I can promise you that you're not alone in this fight. Neither God nor we have abandoned you." That night, back in my room, I found myself doing something I hadn't done in weeks: pray. It wasn't an elegant prayer full of praise. It was a simple whisper in the darkness. "God," I said, "I know I've said horrible things. I don't know if you're listening. I don't know if you care. But please help me. I can't keep living like this. I can handle the depression. I can work on my mental health. But this anxiety, please, just take that away." As I closed my eyes, exhausted, I had no idea that I was about to experience something that would change my life forever. The miracle I had longed for was just hours away. That night, after my conversation with the chaplain and my brief prayer, I fell into an uneasy sleep. The nightmares, which had become my constant companion since my admission, didn't take long to arrive. I saw myself running down an endless hallway, the walls closing in around me, and I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Suddenly, I woke up startled, drenched in cold sweat. The room was dark, barely lit by the dim light filtering under the door. I looked at the digital clock on the nightstand. 3:33 a.m. The devil's hour, I thought ironically. The familiar chest pain had returned with full force, and I felt panic beginning to take over. I tried to breathe deeply, as they had taught me in therapy, but it was useless. Each inhalation felt like breathing through a straw. No, 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 I muttered, gripping the sheets in my fists. Please, not again. I got up from the bed, unable to stay lying down. I began pacing back and forth in the small room, counting my steps in a desperate attempt to distract my mind. 1, 2, 3, 4. Sweat was running down my forehead, and I could feel my heart racing. Was this how I was going to spend the rest of my life? Trapped in this endless cycle of fear and anxiety? 17, 18, 19. Enough. I suddenly shouted, hitting the wall with my fist. The sharp pain in my knuckles was a brief respite from the storm in my mind, but only for a moment. I fell to my knees beside the bed, tears flowing freely down my cheeks. In that moment, I felt more alone and desperate than ever. God, I whispered, my voice breaking. I know I don't deserve your help. I know I've failed you, that I've doubted you. But please, if you're there, if I've ever mattered to you, help me. I squeezed my eyes shut, the words pouring out of me like an uncontrollable torrent. I can't go on like this. This anxiety, it's like a monster that devours me from within. I can deal with the depression. I can work on my mental health, but this is killing me. I opened my eyes, looking up at the ceiling as if expecting to see some divine sign. I beg you, I continued, my voice barely audible. If you can't cure me completely, at least take this away. Take away this anxiety that paralyzes me, that prevents me from living. I'll do anything, anything at all. Just, please, help me. The silence that followed my plea was deafening. For a moment, I stayed there, on my knees, waiting. For what? A beam of heavenly light? A choir of angels? But there was nothing, just the sound of my ragged breathing and the distant hum of the hallway lights. Slowly, I got to my feet, feeling exhausted and empty. I approached the window, pulling back the curtain to look outside. The night was clear, and I could see the full moon shining in the starry sky. What a fool I am, I muttered to myself. Did I really expect a miracle? I returned to bed, sinking into the mattress with a sigh of defeat. I closed my eyes, expecting another night of restless sleep and nightmares. However, just as I was about to fall asleep, I felt something strange. It was as if a wave of calm began to spread through my body, starting in my chest and flowing to my extremities. The pain that had been my constant companion for so long began to diminish, replaced by a sensation of peace that I hadn't experienced in months. I opened my eyes suddenly, surprised by this sudden change. What was happening? Was this a delayed effect of the medication? Or perhaps? I didn't dare complete that thought. Instead, I focused on this new sensation, afraid it would disappear as quickly as it had come. Little by little, my breathing normalized, and I felt the tension leaving my muscles. For the first time in what seemed like an eternity, I felt normal. Not happy, not euphoric, simply at peace. Thank you, I whispered in the darkness, not sure who or what I was thanking. That night, I slept without interruption for the first time since I had entered the hospital. There were no nightmares, no panic attacks, just deep, restorative sleep. What I didn't know at that moment was that upon waking, my life would have changed forever. The miracle I had begged for, against all hope and reason, seemed to have been granted. But would it be permanent? Or was it just a brief respite before the storm returned with greater force? Only the dawn would bring answers to these questions. The first rays of sun filtered through the window when I opened my eyes. For a moment, I lay still, waiting to feel the familiar weight of anxiety on my chest. But it didn't come. I blinked, confused, and took a deep breath. The air filled my lungs effortlessly, without that sharp pain that had accompanied me for so long. What's happening? I muttered to myself, slowly sitting up in bed. I rubbed my eyes, expecting that at any moment the sensation of calm would disappear and anxiety would take over me again. But the seconds passed and nothing changed. I felt normal, a normalcy that I had forgotten how it felt. At that moment, the door to my room opened and Elena, the morning shift nurse, entered. "Good morning, Carlos," she said in her usual cheerful tone. "How did you SLE?" She stopped mid-sentence, looking at me with surprise. "Well, you look different." "I feel different," I responded, still incredulous. "Elena, I don't know how to explain it, but the anxiety, it's gone." Elena approached, her expression a mixture of skepticism and hope. "What do you mean exactly?" "The chest pain, that constant feeling of suffocation. It's not there anymore," I explained, standing up. "I can breathe without effort. I feel at peace." Elena observed me for a moment before taking my wrist to check my pulse. Her eyes opened in surprise. "Your heart rate is normal," she said, "and you're not sweating like usual. Do you think it's because of the medication?" I asked, although deep down I knew it wasn't. No medication had ever had this effect before. "It's possible," Elena responded, though her tone suggested she didn't really believe it either. "I'm going to call Dr. Ramirez. I think he'll want to see you." As Elena left the room, I approached the window. The outside world, which for so long had seemed threatening and overwhelming, now looked beautiful. I could see the trees swaying gently in the breeze, hear the birds singing. It was as if my senses had sharpened, free from the veil of anxiety. Dr. Ramirez arrived a few minutes later with an expression of curiosity on his face. "Carlos," he said, entering the room, "Elena has told me something quite interesting. Can you explain to me what's happening?" I told him everything. The conversation with the chaplain, my desperate prayer in the middle of the night, and how I had awakened feeling completely different. The doctor listened attentively, his expression becoming more intrigued with each word. When I finished, he remained silent for a moment, as if processing the information. "Well," he finally said, "this is certainly unusual. Let's run some tests to see if we can understand what has happened." The following hours were a whirlwind of medical tests. They took blood samples, performed an electrocardiogram, even took me for an MRI. The whole time, I waited for the effect to wear off, for anxiety to take hold of me again. But it didn't. Finally, Dr. Ramirez called me to his office to discuss the results. "Carlos," he began, looking at me over his glasses, "I've reviewed all your tests and, frankly, I cannot explain what has happened. Your cortisol levels, the stress hormone, have dropped significantly. Your blood pressure is normal, your heart rate is stable. From a medical standpoint, you no longer show the physical signs of severe anxiety that you had yesterday. So what does this mean, doctor?" I asked, almost fearful of the answer. Dr. Ramirez removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Carlos, I've been in this profession for over 30 years, and I've never seen anything like this. I cannot explain it scientifically. Some might call it a miracle." The word miracle resonated in my mind. Was it possible? Had God really heard my desperate plea? "What happens now?" I asked, suddenly feeling overwhelmed by the possibilities. "Well," said the doctor, leaning forward, "I think we should keep you under observation for a few more days. I want to make sure this change is stable before considering your discharge. But if everything continues like this, Carlos, you might be able to go home soon." I left Dr. Ramirez's office feeling as if I were floating. I stopped in the hallway, looking around as if seeing the world for the first time. Colors seemed brighter, sounds clearer. It was as if a veil had been lifted from my senses. "Thank you," I whispered, unsure whether I was addressing God, the universe, or simply the air around me. "Thank you for this second chance." As I walked back to my room, I realized this wasn't the end of my journey, but the beginning. The anxiety might be gone, but I still had much work to do. Depression was still there, waiting to be faced. But for the first time in a long time, I felt I had the strength to do it. What I didn't know at that moment was that my experience would have an impact beyond myself. In the days and weeks that would follow, my story would become a beacon of hope for other patients in the psychiatric unit. And although doctors would continue searching for a scientific explanation, I knew in my heart that I had experienced something that went beyond science. A true miracle. The days following my inexplicable improvement were like waking up from a long, dark dream. Each morning, I opened my eyes expecting the heavy cloud of anxiety to have returned, but instead, I found myself with a mental clarity that I had forgotten existed. One morning, while having breakfast in the common dining room, Maria, one of the patients with whom I had developed a friendship, sat across from me with a curious expression on her face. "Carlos," she said quietly, "is it true what they're saying? That you've been cured?" I put down my spoon and looked at her, aware that several other patients were watching us from the corner of their eyes. "I don't know if cured is the right word," I responded carefully. "But yes, something has changed. The anxiety. It's gone." Maria looked at me with a mixture of amazement and something that seemed almost like envy. "How?" she asked. "What did you do?" I hesitated for a moment. How to explain something that I didn't fully understand myself? "Honestly, Maria, I'm not sure. I prayed, desperately. And the next day, I woke up and everything was different. A miracle," she whispered, her eyes shining with a spark of hope. "Maybe," I replied, feeling a bit uncomfortable with the attention. "But look, I'm still here. I still have to work on my depression. It's not like everything is suddenly perfect." Maria nodded slowly, processing my words. "But still, it gives hope, doesn't it?" Her comment made me reflect. Could my experience really inspire hope in others? The idea somewhat overwhelmed me. That afternoon, during my individual therapy session with Dr. Sanchez, I shared my thoughts about the conversation with Maria. "Carlos," said Dr. Sanchez, leaning forward in her chair, "what you've experienced is extraordinary. But you're right to be cautious. Recovery is a process, not a single event." "I know," I responded. "It's just that I feel almost guilty. Here I am, feeling better overnight, while others continue struggling." Dr. Sanchez looked at me with understanding. "That's empathy, Carlos. It's a good sign. But remember, your improvement doesn't take anything away from anyone else. In fact, as Maria said, it can give hope." I reflected on her words for a moment. "So what do I do now?" "Now," she said with a smile, "you start rebuilding. The anxiety may be gone, but you still have work to do. What would you like to achieve during the rest of your stay here?" Her question took me by surprise. For the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to think about the future. I would like to be able to read again," I finally said. "Before, I couldn't even concentrate on a page." "Excellent," replied Dr. Sanchez. "Let's start there." The following days were a constant rediscovery. With the help of the hospital staff, I began reintroducing activities that anxiety had stolen from me. I started with short books, stories I could read in a single session. At first, I struggled to concentrate for more than a few minutes, but gradually, I was able to immerse myself in the stories. One afternoon, while I was sitting in the hospital garden with a book in my lap, the chaplain approached and sat beside me. "I see you've returned to reading," he commented with a kind smile. "Yes," I replied, closing the book. "It's like rediscovering an old friend." The chaplain nodded. "Carlos, I've heard about your transformation. How do you feel about it?" I thought for a moment before responding. "Grateful," I said finally, "but also a little scared." "Scared?" asked the chaplain, raising an eyebrow. "It's just, what if it comes back? What if this is only temporary?" I confessed, expressing for the first time the fear that had been lurking in the back of my mind. The chaplain looked at me with understanding. "Faith, Carlos, is not the absence of doubts. It's the strength to move forward despite them. What you've experienced, whatever it is a gift. But remember, gifts aren't meant to be kept, but to be shared." His words resonated with me in a way I hadn't expected. "Share it?" I asked, intrigued. "Yes," replied the chaplain. "Your story, your experience, can be a light for others who are going through dark times. You don't have to understand everything for it to be meaningful." That night, lying in my bed, I reflected on the chaplain's words. I looked at the book on my nightstand, a tangible symbol of my progress. I thought about Maria and the other patients, about their struggles and hopes. I made a decision. The next day, I would ask to participate in group sessions, not just as a patient, but to share my experience. I didn't have all the answers, but if my story could offer a ray of hope to someone else, it was worth telling. As I fell asleep, I felt a peace that went beyond the absence of anxiety. It was the peace of someone who, after a long time, could finally see a path forward. The miracle I had experienced wasn't just the disappearance of anxiety, but the opportunity to rediscover who I was without it. And I was ready to make the most of that opportunity. Several months have passed since I left the psychiatric hospital. Normal life welcomed me with its own challenges, but nothing compared to the hell of anxiety I had experienced before. However, as days turned into weeks and weeks into months, a persistent question began to haunt my mind. Was it really a miracle? One Sunday afternoon, while having coffee in my small apartment, the sound of my phone pulled me from my thoughts. It was Maria, my friend from the hospital. Carlos. Her voice sounded tense on the other end of the line. Do you have a moment? Of course, Maria. What's wrong? There was a pause before she answered. It's just, I've had a relapse. The anxiety. It's back with full force. I felt as if an icy fist squeezed my heart. I'm so sorry, Maria. Is there anything I can do? It's just that. Her voice broke a little. I thought of you, of your story, and I was wondering, how do you do it? How do you keep faith when things get worse again? Her question hit me like a hammer. How could I answer her when I myself struggled with similar doubts? Maria, I began, carefully choosing my words. The truth is I don't have all the answers. Some days, I wake up fearing it will all come back. That anxiety will return and drown me again. But then, how? Wait, I gently interrupted her. Let me finish. Yes, I'm afraid sometimes. But then I remember something the hospital chaplain once told me. Faith isn't the absence of doubts, but the strength to move forward despite them. There was silence on the other end of the line. I could imagine Maria processing my words. What if I don't have that strength? She finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. You do? I replied with conviction. The fact that you called me proves it. You're not alone in this, Maria. And if you need help finding that strength, I'm here. After hanging up, I stood staring out the window, lost in my thoughts. Maria's call had stirred something in me. It was true that I no longer suffered from that paralyzing anxiety, but did that mean I was cured? As if the universe wanted to test my words, that same night I felt a flash of that familiar sensation in my chest. It wasn't as intense as before, but it was there. A reminder that the battle never really ends. I sat on the edge of my bed, breathing deeply as I had been taught in therapy. It's okay, I told myself. This doesn't define me. I can handle it, and I did. The sensation passed after a few minutes, leaving me exhausted but relieved. It was a stark reminder that, miracle or not, recovery is an ongoing process. The next day, I decided to visit Dr. Ramirez at his private practice. I needed to talk to someone who understood both the medical aspect and the more inexplicable side of my experience. Carlos, the doctor greeted me with a warm smile. How have you been? I told him about Maria's call, my own doubts, and the brief episode of anxiety from the night before. Dr. Ramirez listened attentively, nodding occasionally. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. Carlos, he began, what you experienced in the hospital was extraordinary. From a medical standpoint, I cannot explain it. But that doesn't mean you're cured in the traditional sense. What do you mean? I asked, feeling a mixture of confusion and apprehension. Mental health isn't black and white, he explained. What you experienced, call it a miracle or spontaneous remission, gave you an opportunity. An opportunity to learn to manage your mind without the overwhelming weight of severe anxiety. But that doesn't mean you'll never feel anxiety again. His words, although somewhat discouraging, made sense. So what do I do now? You continue, he replied with a kind smile. You continue working on yourself, using the tools you've learned. And remember, Carlos, your experience, whatever it may be, is valid. You don't need to have all the answers for it to be meaningful. I left Dr. Ramirez's office feeling, not exactly at peace, but more centered. As I walked down the street, I reflected on everything that had happened. Was it a miracle? Maybe. Was it an inexplicable medical remission? Possibly. Did the label I put on it really matter? What I did know was that I had received a second chance, an opportunity to live, to grow, to help others like Maria. And that opportunity, that gift, was something I didn't intend to waste. That night, before going to bed, I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I wrote in a journal. The words flowed, carrying with them part of the burden I had been carrying. I don't know if what I experienced was a miracle in the traditional sense. What I do know is that it changed my life. It gave me the opportunity to rediscover myself, to learn to live without the constant weight of anxiety. But it also taught me that recovery isn't a destination, but a journey. A journey with ups and downs, with doubts and fears, but also with hope and growth. I don't have all the answers, and maybe I never will. But each day that I get up and choose to move forward, each time I can lend a hand to someone like Maria, I feel that I'm honoring that gift, whatever its origin. And for now, that's enough. I closed the journal and turned off the light. Tomorrow would be another day, with its own challenges and opportunities. And for the first time in a long time, I truly felt ready to face it.